everyone, and a huge welcome to our event tonight. We at Beulah are passionate about Anti-Slavery Day, which is taking place tomorrow, the 18th of October. 10 years ago, almost to this very day, Lavinia and I witnessed the realities of modern-day slavery whilst working in an aftercare home with women who had been rescued from the sex trade. We decided to set up a business which could create employment opportunities but could also be a real force for good. We exist to empower vulnerable and trafficked women through the business of fashion and doing all we can to speak out on the issue and ensure that our supply chains are fully transparent.
This year, to celebrate Anti-Slavery Day, we're launching our For Freedom t-shirt, which you can see over there, with 100% of proceeds going to one of our favourite charities, Justice and Care, who are tackling slavery head-on. Justice and Care is a charity that is very close to both Nat's and my hearts, having witnessed the incredible work that they're doing out in India a couple of years ago. What we love about Justice and Care is that they not only work with survivors of slavery and human trafficking, but they also work with the police and governments to bring perpetrators to justice and spark systemic change. Please do join us in supporting this wonderful charity and the work that they do by buying one of our t-shirts this evening, as modelled by the beautiful ladies over there. Each t-shirt is produced ethically with a fully traceable supply chain, made from eco-responsible fibres. And through the embroidery, we provide a fair wage to migrant working women in some of London's poorest communities. I'd now like to hand over to the wonderful Sarah Jane, a great friend and Sky News presenter who, with a panel of experts, will help us to unpack the issue of slavery. And just before I do, Estee, thank you so much. We know how busy you are. You've just launched your own show called the Sara Jane Me Show. So we really appreciate you taking the time to do this. Thank you.
Thank you, girls. A round of applause for the Beulah girls. And Natasha. Thank you very much for inviting me here to host this evening. I'm extremely proud of the work that the girls do. I've been a huge supporter of Beulah for many years now, and through the wonderful Julia Immonen, I am now a proud supporter of Justice and Care and the work that they do. So you two coming together, of course, guarantee me being here tonight. It's said that every 30 seconds, a child is taken into slavery. The statistics are quite simply mind-blowing and a blight on society. Although no one can be sure, according to the United Nations, around the world there are some 40 million victims of slavery. Yeah, every 30 seconds. It is the Sara Jane Me Show here and online. We're broadcasting live to Instagram, everyone. The issue affects every continent and pretty much every country. There are thought to be tens of thousands of slaves here in the UK alone, forced to work in brothels, nail bars, car washes, and farms. The victims are subject to the most awful and unspeakable abuse at the hands of criminal networks who sell them on time and time again, making millions of pounds in the process. It's the fastest growing crime in the world, worth, reportedly, some $150 billion. For those of you who know the current exchange rate, you can translate that into pounds for me, but 150 billion. A low risk, few traffickers are successfully prosecuted, high return business. Well, behind the statistics, which in themselves are jaw-dropping, are individual stories that are more so. People like Salma, one of those that Justice and Care, this amazing charity I'm so proud to support, Christian and Julia, you do incredible things. The charity has been able to help Salma. Let's just take a look at her story.
When I was younger, I used to dream of completing my study. I wanted to become a nurse. and I was in class 10. When I was going to have extra classes to my coaching center, I was walking by road. Then some bad boys dragged me, abducted me and trafficked to Mumbai, India. I got sold in red light area. I used to cry a lot. I was so much scared that what is going to happen with my life. I was physically and mentally tortured by the traffickers. They used to tell me that they will kill me if I will not do what they are saying. One person from Justice and Care came to visit me and I told him about all my story. Then he gave me a hope that he will help me to rescue.
I still remember the night when I was told that Salma was rescued in India. First, I was shared with one photograph of Salma. Then I went down to their parents so that they can identify Salma as their daughter. And subsequently, we facilitated a repatriation from India to Bangladesh.
আমার একমাত্রই মেয়ে আমি তখন আমার হাজবেন্ড আর আমি তখন পাগলের মতো হয়ে গেছিলাম আমাদের কোনো তখন মাথায় কাজ করছিল না যে কি দিয়ে কি করব তখন আমি খুবই আনন্দ হয়েছি বা খুশি হয়েছি বা আমার মেয়েকে পাবো এই আশ্বাস নিয়ে আমি ছিলাম যে আমার মেয়ে আমার বুকের ধন বুকেই আসবে
বিশাল খুশি লাগলো আমার যে মেয়েটা তো যে প্রথম না পাইছি বিশাল আনন্দ লাগলো তখন
When I was in the shelter home, I got to know that I'm pregnant and I fought for my children to bring her with me. When I came back with my daughter to my own country and I saw my parents' face after long years, I was feeling so happy. That was the happiest day of my life.
At Justice and Care, we are helping government for repatriating Bangladeshi victims like Salma from destination countries to Bangladesh. We are protecting vulnerable communities. We are helping border guards to spot potential victims from borders. We are working with police to gather evidence for prosecuting traffickers, caring for victims. We are also working with the stakeholders to bring about systemic changes, and we are also supporting victims to rebuild their life. Salma is one of the hundreds we have been able to help so far, and I'm really proud of her.
I want to build up my own tailoring shop. I'm hopeful that I will be able to make a good future and bright future for myself and for my daughter.
Incredibly brave Salma there telling us her story. And just one of millions of stories like that around the world. Not all of them have those happy endings, but we are working on that. It's my great pleasure this evening to introduce to you an expert panel who are working to make more happy endings just like that. A panel of experts who together are going to talk about some of the issues that surround slavery and particularly how it affects us here in the UK. I'd like to welcome to the stage three people who are each doing all that they can. First of all, the Chief Executive of Justice and Care and someone who took a leading role in bringing about the UK's Modern Slavery Act, Christian Guy. Before he joined Justice and Care, Christian worked as an advisor to David Cameron, although not on Brexit. That's underlined in red here. Second, Dame Sara Thornton, whose role as the UK's independent anti-slavery commissioner came about as a result of that act. Before becoming the anti-slavery commissioner, Dame Sara was the chair of the National Police Chiefs Council. And, last but by no means least, Parosha Chandran, an award-winning human rights barrister, one of the country's leading anti-slavery lawyers. All three of them doing incredible work, and we're about to hear all about it. Please come up and join me. Dame Sara and I are a bit worried there that we didn't wear trousers. We did okay then. We got up with no mishaps. We're all good.
Didn't get a dress.
No. Apparently they just didn't have your sizing, Christian. Next time.
What are you saying?
Let's start, Christian, shall we, with the Modern Slavery Act, which has really led the world in anti-slavery legislation. How did it come about? Whose passion project was it? What was the driver?
Well, first of all, can I thank Beulah too, because it is really inspiring to us that a business like Beulah, leaders like you would stand up and say we care about this and we're deciding to put our lives on it. So thank you for having us here, for all you're doing. It's really inspiring. The Modern Slavery Act, it's easy at the moment to be quite cynical about politics. I feel it, we all feel it. But the Modern Slavery Act is actually an example of where it can produce something positive. The organisation I was running at the time, we were hearing reports of children being trafficked, slaves being found across the country. I met a survivor who was a British girl in a school, had been groomed by an older boyfriend and moved around a network of hotels, and she gave evidence to our organisation. She said one weekend she had been raped 80 to 90 times. She was back into school on the Monday. She thought this was normal. So we woke up to this scandal that was unfolding before our eyes. And we took ourselves all over the country. We worked with NGOs and survivors and academics and police officers and just gathered evidence and brought it back to Westminster and took it to Theresa May with others out on the front line and said we need to do something about this. And we drafted a bill, and it took through Parliament and had a cross-party consensus. And it's one of those, change comes when people work together and say we're not prepared to live with what we have, and we've got a better vision of what can come. And so we used what we had in our hands, which was an act of Parliament, and it has made a difference.
Was it hard for people who you were trying to get on board to get this act passed to grasp the scale of the issue? Because, up to a few years ago probably, when you mentioned slavery, you'd think of history books, or you'd think of it happening in India where girls are nabbed on the street, never to be seen again. You wouldn't think about that happening in London, Manchester. It's
absolutely right. I remember talking to MPs at the time, and a lot of them said, don't bother with this, we haven't got a problem, and others said, it's not a vote winner. And it was quite a difficult argument to have with senior MPs that they should work on this and to convince them there was a problem. But the way we did it was just to provide hard-headed facts and to show that it was happening, to bring them in front of people whose lives have been destroyed. And the police were wonderful, because they were on it and they were exploring this problem of organised crime, and so they came behind us and said this is a growing problem. But there was a cynicism, and part of what we have to do is to help people to see that this isn't something that was dealt with 200 years ago by Wilberforce and others. There are more people in slavery today worldwide than ever before, and a lot of them in this country.
Well, Dame Sarah, as a result of that act, your role came about. What does an anti-slavery commissioner do?
So my role is set out in that Modern Slavery Act that Christians has been talking about, and it's quite simple really. It's to encourage good practice in the investigation, prevention, detection and prosecution of modern slavery and trafficking, and the identification of victims. So my role is not to kind of run organisations or provide services myself, but I have a voice. I have a voice. I can report to Parliament, I can write to ministers. Lots of public authorities such as police forces or border force or local authorities have a duty to cooperate with me. So I'm basically looking for good practice, and also, I'm afraid, sometimes calling out bad practice.
When you came into the role, did you have an idea of the scale of the problem? And once you were into it, did it surprise you?
I'd been a police officer for 33 years, so I had some feel for the issue, particularly I think about sexual exploitation. But I've been doing the role now for just over 5 months, and my eyes have been opened, particularly in respect of the extent of exploitation in labour. So people who are trafficked to this country end up in massive debt to the traffickers, who then keep them in the most abusive, appalling conditions. Will leave them with just a few pounds a week to live on. That kind of labour exploitation, I don't think I was particularly aware of. Extensive domestic servitude. In this great city of ours, there will be people, I suspect, closer than we'll feel comfortable to know, who are living in houses, in effect, with little or no freedom, but certainly working the longest hours, paid way below the minimum wage, very rarely having any days off, let alone holiday. And it's the extent of that sort of exploitation I think I have been continually shocked by. And that sense in which none of us really know how close we are to exploitation, whether in what we're buying important services that we're being provided with, and I think that's been quite an eye-opener for me. And of course, you've just seen that very moving film. I have the privilege in my role to meet lots of victims and survivors and listening to their stories, which are frequently harrowing. But I don't know about you, Christian, but most of all, I'm left with a sense of tremendous courage and resilience, and often hope, actually. People have been through so much, and yet, there is a resilience and a courage which I really do applaud.
And Sara just being the example we've seen tonight, making a life for her and her children. Parosha, you give a voice to those victims in legal terms. You're a leading, if not the leading anti-slavery lawyer in the country. Give us an insight to some of the cases you deal with, because as Dame Sarah touched on there can be so many different kinds of slavery, so many traps that people find themselves in.
Thank you, Sarah Jane. So I've been a barrister for 22 years, and I have brought all of the leading test cases on trafficking that have established rights for trafficked victims since 2004. Last year I was appointed the first professor of modern slavery law at King's College London, and so now it's a great privilege to be able to teach the next generation of law students about how to go forward and take up the baton. When I first started in this field, I'd been a barrister for about 7 years, and in 2004 I found that trafficked victims had no rights in the UK. At that time they were given shelter if they were giving evidence against traffickers only, and then as soon as the criminal trial ended they were being returned to their countries of origin. And what I found through working with a shelter, the Poppy Project, was that the women were actually at very grave risk of reprisals on return to their home countries because their identities had become exposed during the criminal procedure. And there were no immigration rights for protection in the UK. So I set about bringing the first precedent to establish international protection of trafficked victims, which I was able to do in 2008, I think it was. Around the same time, I was contacted by a charity called Hibiscus. They work in women's prisons, and they phoned me and they said that we think we found a trafficked girl in an adult prison, and we're very worried about why this is. So I sent in some trafficking identification experts to take an interview with her, and it transpired that she was 16 years old and she was serving a sentence in Britain for using a false identity card. What had happened was that she had been trafficked from Nigeria to Britain. She had been promised in marriage in her home country to a man who was 64 years old, and at that time she was 15. And she would be the fourth wife, and she was terrified of a life of abuse. And somebody in the village had heard about her plight and said, "Oh, I'll take you to England, I'll get you a job as a nanny, and you'll be safe." But that person didn't intend to give her safety, brought her to England and put her in a brothel where she was abused by British men, who all knew she was a child because when I met her, she was so young. She was able to escape, and from a childhood she had known that she had an uncle in France. So her only thought was, I need to get to France because I can be safe, because she was worried that the trafficker might find her anywhere in England. So she got down to Dover Docks, and in her hand she had an identity card that one of the women had given her, and she was told to put her finger on the photograph because it wasn't hers, and that if border officials came and asked her for her ID, she should show this card. So she was on the coach at Dover, about to get on the ferry to France, when they came and asked her for her ID card along with everybody else. They took her thumb off the card, saw it, and said, "How old are you?" And she said, "I'm 34, which accorded with the age on the card, which was of a white Portuguese woman. Anyway, they arrested her, they took her into custody. Unfortunately, nobody put their finger on the button at all, and even her barrister and her solicitor told her to plead guilty of using a fake document. She did so. Even the female judge in the Crown Court, I say female because actually I think that women were quite harsh sometimes in terms of our judgment. I'm not saying that men aren't, I'm just being equal. But she was then given a sentence of 8 months imprisonment, and nobody sought to look at her age when this young girl was in front of them. So I then brought the first case to establish what was called the non-punishment principle, which is that if you are a traffic victim, then you should be entitled to protection for any crimes that you commit as a direct consequence of the trafficking. Some people are born into their job, and the judge in the case was one of the best judges in the land in the Court of Appeal, Lord Justice Laws. And he found it to be such a shameful set of circumstances, this must never happen again. He quashed her criminal conviction. He required the Crown Prosecution Service to disclose any non-prosecution policies that were hidden in some drawers and to have them published in legal texts. And she went free. But when I looked at the custody record, that is the record of the police officers who had detained her, it said small African girl. Nobody from start to finish looked at this. I have 100 stories I can tell you as to how the cases that perpetuated the motion for the Modern Slavery Act came into play. And I'd love to tell you maybe about one more, if there's time.
Yes, please.
So I'd like to tell you about the case of M, because the work that Beulah is doing is incredible, and to me it was a real privilege to be introduced to them. I've seen them from afar. I saw that they had opened their brand and their ethos and had no introduction to them, and then they sought an introduction to me through a third party, which I thought was so nice recently to enable me to meet you as friends of Beulah now. So I'd like to tell you about the case of M. M was a young girl from Uganda. She was, of course, the beautiful daughter of a mother who loved her dearly. Her father had died and her mother had married again. Her mother then died when M was about 14 years old, and she was living in a village, and there she was subjected to sexual abuse at the hands of the stepfather with no one to protect her. And it's not something that just happens in an African village, as we all know. This happens anywhere in the world, including here. There was a conflict in the northern area of Uganda, and the Lord's Resistance Army came to that village. And M went and hid in a cupboard, and the next morning she came out, and all of the men had been murdered. Most of the women had also, and of course, had been terribly abused. She joined a human column of refugees, and they walked to a refugee camp called Kilak. There, which was supposed to be a place of protection, the soldiers took liberties with the women and the girls. And an older woman told M very soon after she arrived that in order to protect yourself, I'm telling you that there's this one security guard who likes you, so let him take you, and he will prevent you from being raped by many. So she was subjected to sexual abuse by a man who was a lot older than her. She was pregnant with the child of the stepfather. She gave birth in the camp, and the soldier said that he would like to take her away to Kampala, that he loved her, that he would marry her, and he promised her a good life. She was 16 years old. They went to Kampala, and there on the birthday of the baby, a man and woman came, and they were all to go for tea. And as they were leaving the house, the woman was holding the baby, and M went and said, well, I'll take my baby. And the lady said, don't worry, darling, we'll see you there. Well, M never saw her baby again. The baby was sold, trafficked, taken, and M herself was then trafficked to England, where she was put in a brothel, which was a residential house like yours or mine. Neighbours there noticed that women were coming and going freely and men more freely as clients, but there was a girl in the garden who had hung out the clothes, and she never ever left. And somebody called social services, and social services came, found M and took her away. In Britain, we have an immigration policy that if someone is an unaccompanied asylum-seeking child, they can be allowed to stay until they're 17 and a half. And she was about 17 when she was found. So she was put with a very loving foster care family who had been trained to understand child abuse, and she was being looked after. But when it came for the immigration case to enable her to stay, it was refused. The Secretary of State refused her leave, said that she should be able to return to Uganda, and that was that. So appeal lawyers started to bring an appeal, and I was asked to represent her. So I brought psychological evidence from the Helen Bamba Foundation, which is a medical foundation of excellence for the care of trafficked people. And they wrote a very, very important report that showed that she was not only in a case of suicide with such high suicidal ideation almost every day on a rolling basis from the abuse she'd suffered, but in fact, if she was to be returned, then there'd be no doubt that she would have no chance for her survival, that she would take her own life. But they said the very heart of this is that she's still grieving for her own mother. Anyway, I took all the best experts with me, including Ben Knighton, who is a professor from Oxford, to court, and we were refused by a judge who said that they thought the UK had an obligation to protect her. So I had a dark day. I exhausted all appeal rights and I didn't know what to do when I got the call from my solicitor saying it was over, I've lost, and she will be made to return. That night, I went to sleep thinking I'm going to have to go with her to Uganda then, and I'll have to try and find somewhere safe for her, and I'll use every contact I have. This was 11 years ago. The next morning I woke up and I decided to actually do something different. I decided to bring the first case against Britain on a trafficking matter to the European Court of Human Rights. So that court that many people chastise and hate and ridicule was actually the only chance for M when Britain had got it wrong. And I took the case there, and there in Strasbourg within a few months, with about 9 international agencies stepping forward to say they wanted to support the case. Britain did the right thing. They granted her leave and she was safe. So I'll leave it there because I want to ask you a question, which is at what cost? At what cost for M, that whole story of the lack of protection and the finding of freedom?
And others like her are so lucky to have you giving them a voice and fighting for them. I think you'll all agree it's incredible work that you do. Christian, justice and care are intervening in stories like this. What is it that you are doing in the UK to stop cases like this happening?
Yes, so we work in various countries, but we come across lots of cases like the one just set out, and we've decided to get alongside policing and brilliant people like yourself and others in the system to try and provide much better care for victims like Em, get alongside her, bring her every chance of staying, getting support, somewhere safe to live. We've got people in various counties in the UK providing direct support into victims that have been identified by the police, but also helping them to get justice. It's called justice and care for a good reason. We believe both really matter. And what we've seen is that so often survivors get lost in the system, or they simply won't trust police, or they won't engage, they just want to leave it behind. But actually, when they're given a chance to recover and rebuild, they so often want to stand up and ensure that very few people like them ever again experience what they've experienced. So we've got people in the UK providing that support. We call them victim navigators, and they're working alongside police, providing brilliant care as NGO workers, but helping the police to pursue the organised crime groups that frankly for so long have operated internationally with very little chance of getting hit.
Dame Sarah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because we've concentrated on young girls so far, but slavery doesn't discriminate with regards to age or gender. Men are trafficked as well.
That's right. I think originally in the UK, a lot of the cases, in fact the majority of the cases, were cases of women, because a lot of issues about women being trafficked for sexual exploitation, a lot to begin with from Eastern Europe after the Berlin Wall fell, through the sort of 90s and into the 2000s. Since then, as I mentioned, there's been such a growth in labour exploitation, so lots more men involved. And in fact, we have what's known as the National Referral Mechanism, which is where police or border force or local authorities can refer potential victims of modern slavery and human trafficking. And now the majority are in fact men, not women, so it's kind of switched. And I was with a victim of labour exploitation 2 or 3 weeks ago, and you might have heard this case, and in fact there was a Panorama programme which was broadcast last month. It was a case that was in Redditch in the West Midlands. An organised crime group from Poland had trafficked, we believe, about 400 men mainly, but some women from Poland. The police identified, I think, 93 that they got witness statements from, but they think it was probably about 400. And they were brought from Poland. I mean, the deal was normally, these were people who needed money, some of them had maybe drink problems, they're vulnerable in different ways, and the traffickers would say to them, we've got a job for you in the UK, it's a good job, well paid, but if you're going to come, the coach is going tonight or tomorrow morning. So they put pressure on vulnerable people to make a decision immediately. They come to the UK and then were living in the most appalling conditions. I think they normally were allowed maybe about £20 a week to live on. They were living in, rat-infested, cockroach-infested homes, half a dozen to a room, mattresses on the floor, that sort of thing. There was no hot water in quite a few of the houses, just cold water. And their passports had been taken from them, and the organised crime groups had control of their bank accounts. But they were working in low-paid, regular jobs. They just weren't allowed to keep the money. And I was with one of the survivors who'd given evidence in the Crown Court. And your point about care and justice, actually the justice mattered a lot for him, that he'd stood up in the court and the jury had believed what he had to say. But if you saw this guy, he was a huge guy. We have this idea sometimes that victims of trafficking are somehow frail, vulnerable creatures. They're the whole gamut of kind of human beings. And he, a big, strong guy, who had been through the most appalling conditions. And one thing that struck me about his case, and it struck me about some other cases last week, it's this sense, in our country today, there are people who have been trafficked and who are enslaved, who are hungry. The reason why that case came to light in Redditch was because some of the people who had been trafficked were going to a soup kitchen in a church because it was the only time they were getting a hot meal. And somebody who was working at that soup kitchen got chatting to them and eventually gained their confidence and trust, and the stories began to be told. And I then met, maybe it was last week, 3 women who had been domestic workers in London. And they also talked about their hunger. They were working in families where they did not get enough to eat. And I think sort of, hunger is a Dickensian concept. There are people in our country who are hungry because of the abuse that they're going through. And I think that's, a great wake-up call. But in terms of your kind of main question, yeah, victims, all sorts of ages. Parosha talked about young women, but, going up. And I've met victims in their 60s, so every age. In terms of the makeup of nationalities, most victims who are referred in the UK now are UK nationals, but of other countries, a lot from countries such as Vietnam, Albania, Romania, Nigeria, where these are kind of the main countries of origin where they are trafficked from those countries. Often, they're sold a great hope. As you talked about people, there's a job for you. And a lot of people, living precarious lives, the opportunity to earn money for themselves and the family is an opportunity they grasp. And they have a dream. If they come here, they can get a job, and they can send money back home to support their families. And they get here, and, at best it's awful labour exploitation, but everything else from sham marriages to working in brothels to all sorts of abuse and exploitation. And so it's a kind of a mix, all sorts of nationalities, all sorts of ages, men, women, children, boys.
And all sorts of situations as well. And Parosha, that's interesting what Dave and Sarah said there, is that justice is really important for these victims. Of course they want to be rescued, but they want justice. They want the people who have done this to them to pay for what they've done. But the conviction rate for human trafficking and modern slavery remains really low, not just in the UK, but worldwide. What more could be done to bring traffickers to justice?
That's a very good question, Sarah Jane. So the UN, I've been a UN expert on trafficking since 2012, and the UN itself established what's called the Palermo Protocol on Trafficking. It's a legal document in 2000 that gave the international definition of human trafficking, which is basically recruiting, transferring, receiving, harbouring someone for the purpose of exploitation. So they're the two main concepts. And then in the case of an adult, that the person has been subjected to what I call the trafficking trap. They were either deceived, coerced, had their position of vulnerability abused, or they were forced or abducted. The Palermo Protocol says that in order to actually combat human trafficking, we need to have a three-part process. It's a formula. We need to prosecute traffickers. So that comes back to your question. But we also need to protect victims. And we must have prevention strategies. So it's called the 3 Ps: protection, prevention, and prosecution. And that's held together by a relationship between civil society, of which you are all members, and the state. Because the state can do its job to help with the identification of victims, but shelters, trafficking experts need to assist in that. Now, one of the things that I think is, I've found certainly in my work for the UN, it is a stumbling block when it comes to prosecutions, is that coming back to that case of O, where she was prosecuted for using the passport, that's one of the first types of cases. What we now find is that traffickers are using trafficking victims for all forms of exploitation, including criminal activities themselves. So whether it's forcing people to commit theft, or drugs cultivation, or drugs manufacture, the trafficker distances themselves from the crime by using the hand of the trafficked victim to commit the crime. And so then when the crime is detected, who is prosecuted? The victim. So I do want to tell you about another case because it's important to recognise. So in 2000, I think it was around 2010, we suddenly became an exporter of cannabis. Now, why? How did that happen? Because cannabis is on the black market. Well, international organised criminal networks run by Vietnamese gangs were taking over huge proliferation of cannabis factories in the UK, and they were using trafficked children to cultivate the drugs. Particularly Vietnamese boys between the ages of 14 and 17. Now, I was representing in a case where the young boy, some years earlier, because I was trying to overturn his conviction, he was locked in to it was a disused factory in an area of London. The windows were bricked in, the door was bolted from the outside. The drugs inside were worth between 500,000 and £1 million worth of drugs, cannabis. He was sleeping on a sheet on the floor, and his job was to be in charge of the hydroponics along with 3 other miners. The only reason they were found is because burglars ram-raided the property with a vehicle to smash down the wall in order to steal the loot. And at that time, some neighbours in residential areas called the police. When the police came, they arrested the children. They were charged with cannabis cultivation. They were prosecuted and they were imprisoned. Now, I know a lot of you are shaking your heads that it shouldn't have happened. It did happen. And unfortunately, when I brought that appeal to the Court of Appeal in 2012, it was rejected by the Court of Appeal. I think we weren't psychologically ready to apply non-punishment to drugs cases. That's my legal and personal view. I took it to Strasbourg, and we'll see what the outcome is this year. It's taken that long to get heard. Trust me though, of course I wasn't taking no for an answer, so the next year in 2013 I brought another case which I won, and that established rights for all the traffic victims for cannabis cultivation. But talking about this case, all of the hallmarks were there of organised crime with the amount of drugs that were there, but there was no consideration of taking the intelligence or the mobile phones to debrief the victims, to ask them when does someone bring the food, to then investigate who was responsible for the trafficking. And so this is one of my points, that around the world, traffickers deliberately in their business plan criminalise the actions of their victims so that they are then free from being detected and remain impune. And that again proliferates the profits that they are enabled to achieve. And so sometimes the finger is not on the right pulse, is what I'm saying.
That's quite interesting actually. And Dave, Sarah, I want to come back to when these victims are discovered. As we've heard in a couple of cases Parosha was talking about, by police. Are the police force in the UK, do they have a better understanding now of what modern day slavery means? Because, you know, the wider public are just starting to get to grips with it, with the Modern Slavery Act being talked about a lot more. How well equipped are the police to deal with victims of trafficking?
They are better than they were, but not good enough. And there's two kind of aspects to that. One is about identifying potential victims. You know, what are the warning signs? What should they be looking for? And that's something that could apply, generally to any police officer, anybody who is in border force or local authorities. And that's a big challenge because you're talking about thousands of people who need to know what to look for. And the reason why that matters, and that you can't just rely on specialist experts, is that in that first engagement with a potential victim, if officers don't understand the issues, they can put people off from ever coming forward because they can give wrong information, they can just kind of destroy any sort of nascent confidence that's there. So that's really important. It's better than it was, but it's not brilliant. And the sorts of cases that Parosha is talking about, I mean, I can remember 10 years ago, those sorts of warrants executed, cannabis cultivation. The young men were always known as the gardeners, and the easiest thing was to arrest the gardeners and they could be charged with the offence. The harder thing, of course, is to investigate the organised crime group. I think now I'm much more confident that if you execute a warrant and find the gardeners locked in on the floor, they are not the offenders.
It's not always happening though, is it?
It's better than an awful lot better than it was. I think there's general kind of awareness that that's the case. So there is that aspect of identification. But the other point that you asked Parosha about, why are there so few convictions? I absolutely believe that we need to prosecute more traffickers. They regard the risk as low and the rewards as high. And we've got to change that so they regard the risks as high and the rewards as low. And part of that is about more prosecutions, and part of it is when you are prosecuting, these are essentially economic crimes. This is a commodity, a trade in the commodity of human beings. And therefore we need to be investigating their finances and see through the court process, making sure that people's financial assets are seized, and that's not happening enough either. So that's really, really important. The one kind of sort of balancing comment I will make is I'm under no illusions about how complex and complicated these cases are. I mentioned that case in Redditch in the West Midlands. That took 5 years from beginning to end. You might have seen some coverage in the newspapers of a case in Glasgow, which finished on Friday. 4 people convicted of trafficking women from Slovakia into sham marriages, into sexual exploitation. A great case again, but that again had taken 5 years. And they require international cooperation, they require financial investigation, they are complicated and complex. I'm not letting police off the hook, but these are not straightforward cases to investigate. More needs to be done.
probably got another 15 minutes. If anyone does have a pertinent question, do please stick your hand up, but I'm going to carry on the discussion here. Christian, what can we do? Because what Dame Sarah said that made my ears prick up, and it does every time I talk about modern slavery, it never ceases to amaze me. These victims live among us, not too far away. Could be a couple of doors down, could be, at the nail bar that I visit. I do always sort of ask the right questions now when I go in, and that's largely thanks to Julia reading me the Riot Act over lunch one day. And, I do ask the question now, which a couple of years ago I probably never would have done. What can we in this room do?
Yeah, it's a great question. We all have a part to play. We can't leave it to police, we can't leave it to politicians or businesses. I think it's about asking the question and sort of shopping and living with our eyes open, because without building a sense of paranoia and assuming it is in every single house we walk past, let's be more vigilant. When I was growing up, Neighbourhood Watch was very fashionable. My parents had a sticker on the window. I think we've lost a bit of that in this country. Yeah, and I believe that we've got to just be open to the possibility that something's not right. And you can sort of sense it. There's a house down the street from us, and my wife and I are thinking, well, this actually doesn't look quite right. We need to report that, rather than just keep walking past. And there are some great resources online, Home Office, Justice and Care website, all sorts of places you can go to look for the signs, spotting the signs of modern slavery, and what you do. If you see a crime, you think the crime's being committed, it's 999. Dame Sarah will correct me if that's wrong, but there's also great, exactly. Just to check, I haven't been living a lie. But there's also a national helpline for modern slavery that will take cases and referrals and pass them on to police. So it's really about being vigilant without being paranoid, because the police and others need us to play our part.
And businesses as well. We talk about all the sorts of scenarios that workers can get themselves into. And big business can be transparent in their supply chain. Obviously, Beulah's the shining example of that, from start to finish. Well, from start to finish, but you have to be vigilant. I'm sure even at times you think, right, well, I need to check that and make sure everything's okay and everyone's being looked after.
Yeah, one thing the Modern Slavery Act did was introduce this transparency in supply chains, which for any UK business with a turnover of more than 36 million, you have to, in theory, publish a modern slavery statement to see what you're doing to find slavery. And I think we've got to change the culture, because if a business has the courage to look into their supply chains and find slavery, we should celebrate that. We've got to change the culture that says, of fear. So we all know it's out there, and we all sort of claim that there are enormous numbers of people in slavery. If a business has the courage to look for it and finds it, let's say that is a success, and then put support in place alongside them to help deal with it. But for as long as everyone's terrified to look for it, we'll never make progress. And to hit scale on modern slavery, you need governments and you need business. No charity like mine is ever going to get big enough or have the authority to fight human trafficking to the end point. We can do our bit, but it's businesses like Beulah and others who can stand up and say, we're not prepared to recruit people in a certain way and treat them in a certain way anymore.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because, a smaller scale business like Beulah has got some kind of hold on it in terms of they can see every part of the process. But I won't name them, but a big sportswear brand was in the news this week for some of the conditions that workers making some of the clothing were found in. And you do get the sense that some of the bigger businesses, they are so vast that they can't keep a check on everything. And that's where whistleblowers and journalists and ordinary people come in.
Yes, consumers have a massive part to play in asking a question, but I do think in the boardroom this has to become a priority. You remember when we had the scandal of horse meat, when we thought we were eating beef and it was horse, and all of a sudden everything fell apart and there was enormous scandal. We've got people kept as slaves producing things that we eat, buy, wear, shop with, and I don't think in the boardrooms there's enough focus. And the Modern Slavery Act was a start, but too many people are ignoring the law. So let's create a culture. Let's put the regulation in place, but create a culture that says, let's go and look for it. And if we find it, let's do something about it.
Dame Sarah, what more change do you want to see happen? I mean, your role is ongoing. You're forever uncovering things. You're forever coming up with new ways of dealing with this. What's your primary focus at the moment?
So you remember Parosha talked about the 3 Ps in the Palermo Protocol: protection of victims, prosecution of traffickers. The third P, prevention, is sometimes kind of the poor relation, I think. Now, the sorts of things that Christian just talked about businesses, not just abiding by the letter of the law, but the spirit of the law, and that being a really important discussion at board level is really important. But I also think there is something for all of us as consumers, and just raising public awareness, and can we all become conscious consumers? And I say this with some trepidation, sitting in a beautiful Beulah dress, and you're in the business of textiles, but the fashion business in the world is one of massive overproduction and overconsumption. We buy more clothes in this country than anywhere else in Europe. I hope I'm not kind of ruining your business model here, but because you should buy well and buy infrequently. You've seen that new book, Fashionopolis. Apparently, 1 in 6 workers in the globe works in the fashion business, and only 2% get paid a living wage. This is a kind of a sector which is highly risky in terms of slavery and trafficking. And all of us, when we're buying things, need to be so much more demanding about supply chains, about distribution, about how things have got where they're at. Because I think if we had a louder voice and got us kind of assertive about the social cost of goods as we are about the environmental cost, I think that would make a tremendous difference. Government's got a role to play, but they're a little bit consumed with other things at the moment. Business have absolutely got a role to play.
Don't hold your breath.
But actually, I think all of us could do so much more to ask those really difficult questions.
Yeah. Lavinia, you've been talking tonight about the For Freedom t-shirt, which is available to purchase at the back. Can you keep a medium back for me, please? And Lavinia, I know you want to tell us more about your hope for businesses becoming more ethical.
Yeah, so firstly, thank you so much, Dane, Sarah, Christian, Parosha. Really so inspiring, everything that you're doing. I guess sort of to echo what Nat's said about sort of our mission, we obviously exist to empower vulnerable and trafficked women by providing sort of sustainable alternative livelihoods to them in order to help break that cycle of poverty and re-exploitation. So what you were saying about prevention, sort of that's really the heart of how Beulah began. And I guess, our vision, our mission is that hopefully, we can prove that sort of profit and purpose can not only sort of coexist, but also, thrive when both are done in unity, and that actually ethical business, becomes the rule and not the exception. Yeah.
Okay, well, I'm going to bring the panel to a close. We've covered quite a lot in terms of what people can do, but just from each of you, if there was one thing that people could take away tonight, with Anti-Slavery Day fast approaching tomorrow, if there's one thing we can all take away with us tonight, Parosha, what would it be for you?
Do what's morally right. Whatever you do, you're all here today in your own fields with your own expertise, specialisms, knowledge. Work out how to make this your magnetic north in some way, please, and move towards it, whatever it is. It's not about compulsory reporting and having 32 million turnover. Who are the cleaners? Who are the staff? What are your policies? What do you want to do? Over 200 years ago, a collective that was known as the Anti-Slavery Group, that later became Anti-Slavery International, helped to eradicate slavery by doing what was morally right, and no one told them how to do it, but they found a community and a way to do it, and I think that's what's needed now. I'm sorry to just say, just at the last, I know you asked for just one point, but I do want to say something else, which is that it's quite shocking that when the experts calculated how many people were sold and enslaved during the transatlantic slave trade, it was about 13 million people between the 16th to 19th centuries. And yet we have 43 million people in slavery today. So that's a lot, 3-4 times more right now. So this is the time to take leadership. So thank you.
I mean, that's a very sobering statistic, Parosha. Thank you, Christian.
You're here, and that is a brilliant statement in itself. we have to all take responsibility. I'm utterly convinced this is a battle that could be won, that my grandchildren won't have to inherit a country or a community internationally where slavery is rife and children are bought and sold. I believe we can win that battle. It's not going to be easy. And just as Parosha was saying, back then we needed a Wilberforce and a small team to move Parliament. Today we need a nation of people like Wilberforce who will help to get this done. So don't think you can't be part of it, and don't be overwhelmed. This is beatable if we all play our part.
And I'll just say very briefly, can we all move from being casual consumers to conscious consumers?
Well, Dame Sarah, Christian and Parosha, thank you so much for your expertise tonight. It's been fascinating, mind-boggling, inspirational and very moving. Yes, thank you very much everybody for coming. A huge round of applause for our panel. There's always a scene stealer, it's always another TV presenter. Natalie Pinkham would like a question before our panel departs.
Sorry.
First of all, thank you so much. You are tenacious, incredibly brave, brilliant people. Christian, to your point, I felt like a lot of anger firing up in me then when I heard your stories of the exploitation that you deal with on a daily basis. And I also feel an element of concern for you all, because is there a danger on a daily basis for you for being the voice to these vulnerable people, considering the links to organised crime? Therefore, how do you deal with the anger on a personal level? Because I wouldn't be able to sleep at night with those anecdotes just swirling around in my head. And how do you deal with the safety concerns? Because what we need to do as a room and as a nation is follow your example. So if you can explain to us how you deal with that, then perhaps we can do the same.
That's a great question. Wish I'd thought of it. Parosha, I did actually think that when you were saying you were prepared to go back with one of the cases to her home country. Instead, you took it to the European Court of Human Rights.
Yeah. So, gosh, that's a very probing set of questions there. No, it's good. On Monday I was giving a talk at the Royal Institute of Psychiatry on trafficking and trauma, and it was about victims, and somebody threw it back to us as experts and said, how do you cope with the trauma that you have to associate with, like not just 1 year, 2 years, but like more, a few decades of it. So my story on this is short. At the beginning, I found I was ineffective because I was emotionally destroyed by the stories. And when I tried to turn my legal mind to trying to find an answer, I was incapable of doing it. So I did find a way to disassociate myself from the trauma of the trafficking victims by choosing to take a psychological role of being the solution. So being part of the solution helps me to do the work I do without falling as much as I was off a cliff, let's say. In terms of safety, there have been one or two occasions. I mean, my father, he's no longer here, but he was always terrified that the Albanian gangs were going to get me, or the Vietnamese gangs were going to get me, or somebody was. I was like, Daddy, they're not that interested in me. It doesn't matter what I say, no one's really doing anything, But actually, thank God, that was not true, and that actually law did change to keep up with what I was trying to do, and things have spurred forward and changed in the UK and abroad. But you do what is the right thing to do, and we have to be brave, and I teach my son that.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I echo all of that. Anger's a good thing if it's channeled properly, and you any human being that looks at it gets angry, but being part of something that's fighting back in a way that an NGO should is really helpful. And you just also realise there's masses of hope. So stories like Salma's and others, if you can focus on the hope, it also helps. But there's no doubt it kind of haunts you a bit, and you're always thinking of the people you meet, and And also, though, I think there's a sense of duty, because if we don't do something, organised crime groups and others are just operating with impunity. I'm so inspired by police and the police officers that stand in the gap and fight this as well. In terms of safety, there'll be certain members of our team we wouldn't put on a panel. We have to be quite careful about that. Those who are working in certain situations, I mean, we do the job of an NGO, we're not a police force, never would try to be, but inevitably you are exposed to people who are in that field. But I think they rely on other people being paralysed by fear, and you've got to be prepared to stand up, but you do it in a way that minimises risk and tries to stay as safe as possible. So, but it's a constant balance. Sorry.
A similar point to Christian, I think turning anger into determination is a really positive thing if you can. In terms of me now, I'm not sort of hands-on dealing directly with cases, but I would say in all my experience as a police officer and working with police officers, it's that challenge of getting the right line between the professionalism and the objectivity and the clear thinking that Parosha talked about, but never losing your empathy. And it's really quite tough, because as you become more professional, you get used to things, you become more resilient. Of course you've got to cope with awful things you come across, but somehow you must never lose that empathy and that human touch, and I think that's the challenge. And I have met so many people in my previous roles, but in this role, who are working directly with victims, prosecuting traffickers, and I just salute their tenacity and their courage.
I think we all echo that. Any more questions before? Yeah, I knew it was only going to be. No, but it was worth putting it in. That was a great question. Thank you, Pinks. Ladies and gentlemen, once again, a huge round of applause for Pinks.